Welcome to a deep exploration of the hidden genealogy of homeowner associations. Our opening slide introduces Richard T. Ely, a pioneering progressive-era economist, and frames the main theme: how his ideas about property and contract birthed both the modern HOA and a racially exclusive housing system. The time window, 1880 to 1920, signals that we are stepping back to an era when reformers believed government and experts could re-engineer society. Yet, as we will discover, these aspirations were intertwined with beliefs in racial hierarchy. The phrase, "bypass the Constitution," hints at the core argument, that private covenants were used to evade the Equal Protection Clause. This title slide invites us to consider how a seemingly technical concept, the Homeowners Association, emerged from broader intellectual currents about social control, property rights, and racial segregation. Before we dive into chronology, this summary outlines the journey ahead. First, we will see how the progressive movement sought to regulate big business and promote social welfare, recasting property and contracts as tools of public policy. Second, Ely's social theory argued that property exists only by society's recognition. Therefore, society may reshape it. His view legitimized regulation and taxation, but also opened the door for private agreements that could exclude. Third, key Supreme Court decisions struck down overt racial zoning, prompting developers to pivot to private covenants. Fourth, J.C. Nichols and like-minded developers institutionalized HOAs and racially restrictive covenants, showing how quickly ideas turned into industry practice. Finally, the overarching message is that private contracts circumvented constitutional protections, entrenching segregation and laying the groundwork for today's housing inequities. Keep these themes in mind as we move through each milestone. They will weave together into a powerful narrative about how ideas become law and how law shapes lives. To understand how Ely's ideas influenced housing, we must unpack his social theory of property and contract. Ely argued that property rights are granted by society for social purposes. They are not inherent or natural. In his 1914 treatise, Property and Contract, he wrote that private property exists to serve the public good. Consequently, society may regulate property through taxes, zoning, and inheritance laws. He extended this logic to contracts, insisting that courts and legislatures should enforce only those agreements that align with social welfare. These theories legitimized regulation, but also provided a blueprint for private covenants that could exclude, under the guise of protecting property values. At the same time, Ely endorsed eugenics and racial hierarchy. He believed in race betterment, characterizing Black Americans as grown-up children, and advocating restrictive policies to preserve racial purity. Ely's combination of social control and racial ideology created an intellectual environment in which planning, exclusion, and property were deeply entwined. This slide foreshadows how his students would translate these doctrines into concrete housing policies. The Progressive era's first attempt at racial separation came through racial zoning. But in 1917, the U.S. Supreme Court, in Buchanan v. Worley, struck down a Louisville ordinance that barred Black residents from buying property on blocks where whites lived. The court held that such laws violated the 14th Amendment's protections for freedom of contract and property rights. While this decision seemed like a civil rights victory, it had an unintended consequence. Developers and real estate boards turned to private covenants. Unlike public zoning ordinances, restrictive covenants were framed as voluntary agreements among property owners, and therefore, under the prevailing interpretation, did not trigger constitutional scrutiny. The National Association of Real Estate Boards Code of Ethics codified this practice. Article 34, 1924, instructed realtors never to introduce members of any race or nationality whose presence would be detrimental to property values. Covenants attached to deeds prohibited sales to people of African, Asian, or Jewish descent. In Corrigan v. Buckley, 1926, the Supreme Court reinforced this private-public distinction by refusing to invalidate a racially restrictive covenant, holding that the 14th Amendment applies only to state action. The stage was thus set for decades of segregation via contracts rather than ordinances. This slide underscores that the shift from public law to private agreement was deliberate and strategic. No developer did more to institutionalize the modern HOA than J.C. Nichols of Kansas City. In the 1910s and 1920s, Nichols assembled the Country Club District, a 6,000-acre planned community. He embedded covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs, in each deed, binding future owners to design standards, lawn maintenance, and mandatory homeowners association membership. These covenants ran with the land, meaning they were enforceable against all subsequent purchasers. Nichols also included racial bans, declaring that no person of African, Asian, or Jewish descent could occupy the property except as a domestic servant. The district's homeowners association enforced these rules, collected dues, and maintained common areas, the template for thousands of HOAs that followed. Nichols served on the National Association of Real Estate Board's City Planning Committee and promoted his development model nationally. By coupling aesthetic uniformity with racial exclusion, he demonstrated how private covenants could circumvent the Constitution while enhancing property values. This slide shows a portrait of Nichols and an excerpt from one of his restrictive deeds, grounding the narrative in concrete artifacts. Ely's influence extended far beyond academia. Many of his students and colleagues took prominent positions in the burgeoning federal housing bureaucracy. Ernest McKinley Fisher, who earned a PhD under Ely and collaborated at the Wisconsin Institute, wrote Principles of Real Estate Practice for the National Association of Real Estate Boards. Fisher taught that minority buyers diminished property values and advocated covenants as stabilizing tools. Frederick Babcock, an appraiser mentored by Ely and Fisher, became chief underwriter at the FHA. His manuals instructed appraisers to consider race when evaluating property risk. Homer Hoyt, educated at the University of Chicago but immersed in Ely's network, served as chief economist at the FHA, creating the sector theory that underpinned redlining maps. Spurgeon Bell and Henry Hoagland, protégés of Ely's colleague H. Morton Bodfish, ran research divisions at the Federal Home Loan Bank Board and the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Collectively, these disciples translated Ely's theories into policy, embedding racial assumptions into underwriting standards, training manuals, and research. This slide, presented as a table, makes clear that the institutional apparatus of federal housing did not spring from nowhere. It was staffed by a tight intellectual network. Having met Ely's protégés individually, we now visualize their interconnections. The radial flowchart places Richard T. Ely at the center and arranges his disciples around him. At the top sits J.C. Nichols, representing the direct translation of academic ideas into real-world development. To the left are Ernest Fisher, Frederick Babcock, and H. Morton Bodfish, each of whom propagated Ely's teachings through scholarship, underwriting, and industry advocacy. To the right are Homer Hoyt, Spurgeon Bell with Henry Hoagland, and Byron Hankey, figures who carried these ideas into federal agencies and later codified the HOA model in post-war suburbia. At the bottom appear Arthur Weimer and Richard Ratcliffe, scholars who helped formalize real estate appraisal theory. Lines radiate from Ely to each node, underscoring that these seemingly disparate actors were part of a single academic lineage. This diagram reinforces the lecture's argument. The segregationist policies of the 20th century were not random, but the product of a coordinated intellectual network. After mapping Ely's network, we take a step back to examine the legal foundations of restrictive covenants and why the distinction between property and contract mattered. Under property law, rights are enforceable against all future owners. They run with the land. Courts require 4 elements for a covenant to be a real property interest. 1. The original parties intended it to bind successors. 2. It touches and concerns the land by affecting its use or value. 3. There is privity of estate between the parties. And 4. Later owners have notice. Because property rights burden third parties, the law limits them to standardized forms and requires public recording. In contrast, contract rights are personal obligations that bind only the original parties and terminate when property is sold. They can be freely customized and typically yield damages rather than specific performance. Restrictive covenants arose in England as equitable promises to preserve land use. In Tulk v. Moxhay, 1848, a buyer agreed to keep Leicester Square as a garden. When a later purchaser tried to build on it, the Court of Chancery held that it would be most inequitable to allow the purchaser to obtain a better title than the seller. The covenant attached to the land and bound him. U.S. courts imported this doctrine. Cases like Neponsit v. Emigrant, 1938, affirmed that covenants run with the land only if they meet the intent, touching concern, and privity requirements. Practical examples help clarify this. A homeowner might promise not to build a fence taller than 6 feet, or a developer might pledge to maintain common green spaces. Because these promises are recorded in deeds, they bind future owners and illustrate property law in action. The slide's right column traces how racial exclusion entered this framework. After Buchanan v. Worley struck down racial zoning ordinances, developers and realtors turned to private agreements. In Corrigan v. Buckley, 1926, the Supreme Court dismissed a challenge to a racial covenant, holding that the 13th and 14th Amendments apply only to state action. Courts thus treated racial covenants as contracts, outside constitutional reach. Contemporary critics, such as the NAACP, argued that these covenants undermined property rights and public policy, but the courts disagreed. Originally used to preserve open space and aesthetics, restrictive covenants were weaponized to exclude blacks, Jews, and other minorities. By shifting their interpretation from property to contract, the courts allowed segregationist agreements to endure and evade constitutional scrutiny. The courts periodically intervened in this evolving system, but their rulings often had unintended consequences. Buchanan v. Worley, 1917, invalidated racial zoning ordinances, but, as we have seen, encouraged private covenants. In Corrigan v. Buckley, 1926, the court refused to strike down a restrictive covenant, reasoning that the 14th Amendment restrains only state action. This decision effectively greenlighted racial covenants nationwide. It was not until Shelley v. Kramer, 1948, that the Supreme Court held that courts could not enforce racially restrictive covenants because judicial enforcement constitutes state action and therefore violates the Equal Protection Clause. Even then, covenants persisted informally because homeowners and realtors used social pressure and threats to maintain exclusivity. Finally, Barrows v. Jackson, 1953, ruled that damages could not be awarded for breaching a racial covenant, closing the last door to legal enforcement. Yet by this point, decades of covenants had left an indelible mark on housing patterns. This slide summarizes the cases in a table, highlighting how shifts between public law and private contract shaped the segregationist landscape. While courts debated covenants, federal agencies turned them into de facto requirements. In the 1930s, the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, and the Home Owners Loan Corporation, HOLC, were created to rescue the mortgage market. Under Frederick Babcock's leadership, the FHA's Underwriting Manual urged appraisers to investigate whether incompatible racial and social groups were present, and warned that similar price ranges did not matter if certain racial aspects render the locations actually non-competitive. The manual insisted that covenants prohibiting these groups were essential for stability. As a result, banks would not issue FHA-insured mortgages unless deeds contained racial restrictions. The HOLC generated redlining maps that graded neighborhoods from A to D. Black and immigrant areas were almost always marked D in red, indicating no loans should be made. These maps institutionalized redlining, directing investment to white suburbs and starving minority neighborhoods of credit. Statistics reveal the impact. Less than 2% of FHA loans went to non-white buyers, and by 1948, about 85% of new developments were racially restricted. The slide's bar chart visualizes this disparity, and the reproduced advertisement for a restricted white community shows how openly developers marketed these policies. Together, the underwriting manuals, maps, and marketing messages cemented segregation far beyond what any individual covenant could achieve. Even after courts declared racial covenants unenforceable, their legacy persisted. Homeowners and associations continued to insert racially restrictive language in deeds through the 1950s and 1960s. Social pressure, steering by real estate agents, and violence ensured that most minority families could not move into white suburbs. Redlining maps remained reference points for lenders and insurers. By 1948, approximately 85% of new developments still included racial covenants. It took the Fair Housing Act of 1968 to explicitly outlaw housing discrimination, but by then, the patterns were entrenched. The consequences are visible in today's wealth disparities. White households hold a median net worth around $79,000, while Black households average about $7,500, a more than tenfold gap. These differences reflect generations of accumulated equity in homes that minorities were denied the chance to buy. Racially restrictive covenants also contributed to segregated schools, unequal public services, and concentrated poverty. Although HOAs can no longer bar residents by race, they continue to control access through architectural standards, dues, and other economic barriers. Understanding these legacies is essential if we are to confront the structural roots of inequality. The concluding slide synthesizes 3 key lessons. First, the intellectual origins of modern housing policy show that progressive ideals and racist hierarchies were not mutually exclusive. Ely's theory of property as a social trust justified intervention but also rationalized exclusion. His students carried these ideas into practice, demonstrating how academic theories shape the real world. Second, the distinction between private contracts and constitutional law was exploited to perpetuate segregation. When racial zoning was struck down, developers reframed segregation as voluntary agreements, and courts accepted the fiction that private covenants were outside constitutional reach. Only decades later did courts recognize that enforcing these covenants constituted state action. Third, the enduring impact of these policies still shapes our communities. HOAs, redlining, and racially restrictive covenants entrenched racial wealth gaps and segregated suburbs. Acknowledging this history is not merely an academic exercise, it is a call to action. If we accept Ely's notion that property serves the public good, we must ensure that our housing policies promote fairness and inclusion. Addressing the legacy of redlining requires investing in marginalized neighborhoods, enforcing fair housing laws, and reimagining HOAs as instruments of community rather than exclusion. The story of Richard T. Ely and his network is a cautionary tale about how good intentions mixed with prejudiced beliefs can produce long-lasting harm. But it also points toward a future in which we can consciously choose more equitable paths. It is important to note that the institution created by the figures we just presented have not changed, and it was not only Blacks that were excluded, but deeds also had clauses excluding Hebrews, Syriacs, Armenians, Italians, Greeks, Mongoloids, and Chinese, which can still be found today. See, the only way to deprive someone of their constitutional right of property ownership, a system with dictatorial powers outside the normal legal system needed to be created. And it is that system which still exists today. If we want to change what is going on in HOAs, we must either abolish the institution or radically transform it.